December 8th, 2008, Gatwick Airport, London. Among the hundreds of travellers passing through customs that morning was a man who once wore England's cricket colours with pride. His name was Chris Lewis. A decade earlier, crowds had cheered his every delivery, his every boundary. Now, he was walking through the terminal carrying a suitcase that would end his freedom and redefine his name forever. Inside that suitcase, concealed within tins of liquid, customs officers discovered 3.37 kilograms of cocaine, the value over £100,000. For a moment, disbelief silenced everyone who heard the news. Chris Lewis, the all-rounder once seen as England's next big hope, was now being led away in handcuffs. The contrast was devastating. Only years earlier, he had been celebrated for his discipline, his athleticism, and his pride in representing his adopted nation. He had stood under the spotlight as a symbol of potential, a man who could restore balance to English cricket. But fame can be fragile, and success often masks quiet struggles. Behind the applause were years of criticism, isolation, and disappointment. What drives a national hero to such a desperate act? Was it greed, failure, or a life collapsing under pressure? The truth was not simple. It was shaped by ambition, by rejection, and by the slow erosion of identity. This story is not just about sport. It's about a man who rose from the streets of Georgetown, Guyana, to England's grand stadiums, only to lose everything to a single decision. It is a story of downfall, of shame, and of the search for redemption. The man once called a star became a symbol of what happens when brilliance and despair collide. Claremont Christopher Lewis was born on February 14th, 1968, in Georgetown, Guyana, a place where cricket was more than just a sport. It was identity. It was pride. For generations across the Caribbean, cricket had been the language of resistance, a way for ordinary men to challenge the echoes of colonial power through sheer talent and spirit. From dusty neighbourhood pitches to local tournaments, young Chris learned that every run, every wicket was a statement, proof that his people could stand equal on the global stage. When his family moved to England, that belief collided with a harsh new reality. Britain promised opportunity, but it also came with barriers. The 1980s were a difficult time for young black athletes in English sport. Although many were praised for their natural ability, but rarely trusted with responsibility. For Lewis, that meant every game carried double pressure, to perform not only for himself, but for acceptance. At Leicestershire, where he began his county career in 1987, his potential was undeniable. He bowled with speed and purpose, his athleticism catching the eye of selectors and spectators alike. He was tall, powerful, and played with a quiet edge, a player who could shift momentum in a heartbeat. England, still searching for its next great all-rounder after Ian Botham, began to take notice. But behind the applause lingered an unspoken truth. Lewis was always being judged against two worlds, too Caribbean for some, too English for others. Every success was celebrated, but every mistake was magnified. By the time he earned his England debut in 1990, he was more than just a cricketer chasing dreams. He was a young man fighting to belong, carrying with him both the pride of his heritage and the heavy expectation of a nation that never fully embraced him. When Chris Lewis first stepped into England's international cricket setup, he wasn't just filling a gap, he was stepping into destiny. Born in Guyana and raised in South London, his journey to the England squad in 1990 marked more than just sporting achievement. It was symbolic of the multicultural shift in British sport. When a last-minute injury opened a spot for him on the West Indies tour, Lewis grabbed the moment with quiet determination. The raw pace, the natural athleticism, the confidence under pressure, all signalled the arrival of a player who didn't just belong, but could redefine what English cricket looked like. By the time England faced New Zealand in 1991, Lewis had transformed from an unknown talent into a force that demanded respect. His six-wicket haul in Birmingham, delivered with controlled aggression, stunned critics who doubted his readiness for the international stage. Then came his unexpected half-century at number 10, a display of grit that proved he was more than a bowler. England had long searched for an all-rounder who could replicate the golden balance of past greats, and in Lewis, they believed they had found their answer. He wasn't merely performing, he was embodying England's hope for revival. The 1992 World Cup became the height of his early promise. Under bright lights and global scrutiny, Lewis delivered some of his most memorable spells. His fierce bowling dismantled Sri Lanka and the West Indies, earning him multiple Man of the Match awards. England's journey to the final, though ending in defeat, cemented his reputation as one of the tournament's brightest revelations. Commentators spoke of him as the next Botham, fans saw him as the symbol of modern England, and selectors placed upon him the burden of expectation that comes only with brilliance. But success has its price. As Lewis rose, the lens tightened. Every off day became a headline, every inconsistency a question mark. The English media, always quick to anoint heroes and quicker to dismantle them, began dissecting his technique, his temperament, even his personality. They painted him as gifted but unreliable, praise mixed with poison. What few understood was that Lewis was battling more than swing and seam. He was confronting cultural isolation and the subtle weight of being a black athlete in a space that still viewed him as an outsider. Behind the calm facade stood a young man wrestling with impossible expectations. His body carried the strain of relentless schedules. His mind carried the weight of public judgment. He wanted to belong, to be respected on merit, not reduced to a symbol or stereotype. Yet, as England's hopes grew, so did the shadow over his own identity. The fame that once felt like validation began to feel like confinement. Still, in those early years, Lewis embodied raw potential. To the public, he was England's great hope, a man who could change matches with either bat or ball. To teammates, he was a blend of humour and intensity, confident yet reflective. To himself, however, there lingered a question he could never quite escape. How long could he keep proving he was enough? This phase of his life glowed with brilliance but flickered with fragility. What began as a dream run for England's newest star was also the beginning of the emotional storm that would later define him. For a nation desperate for heroes, Chris Lewis had become the promise of something extraordinary. For Chris Lewis himself, he was standing at the summit of success. Without realizing, he was already standing on the edge of a fall. By 1994, Chris Lewis had already lived through the dizzying heights of national fame and the slow erosion of public faith. But nothing in his career symbolized that downfall more brutally than a single tabloid headline, "The Prat Without a Hat." What began as an act of generosity ended as a national joke. Lewis had shaved his head to raise money for charity, a simple, harmless gesture. Yet under the blazing Caribbean sun, the decision proved costly. He suffered sunstroke during England's tour of the West Indies, and what might have been a minor personal mishap became the foundation of relentless mockery. The British tabloids, notorious for their appetite for scandal and ridicule, latched onto the incident with vicious delight. Overnight, Lewis was no longer the gifted all-rounder who could win matches. He was the foolish cricketer who forgot his hat. The story spread across headlines and television segments, framed not with empathy, but with ridicule. The nickname stuck, echoing far beyond the boundaries of cricket. For the press, it was entertainment. For Lewis, it was humiliation dressed as humour, a moment that stripped him of dignity in front of a nation that once cheered his name. In the world of English cricket, where perception can shape destiny as much as performance, that incident marked a turning point. The respect he had earned through talent and hard work began to erode under the weight of laughter. His teammates moved on, but the media never did. Every subsequent failure, no matter how small, was tied back to that single mistake. The cruel caricature of the Prat without a hat overshadowed his discipline, his effort, and even his courage. He became a punchline in pubs and press rooms alike, a man reduced to a meme before the word existed. Yet even under the strain of public humiliation, Lewis continued to perform. During that same West Indies tour, he bowled long punishing spells under unforgiving heat, often carrying England's bowling attack almost alone. His endurance was undeniable, his professionalism intact. But none of it seemed to matter. The public narrative had already shifted, and once perception hardens, truth rarely changes it. The press didn't see resilience, they saw irony. To them, every over he bowled under the sun only deepened the joke. This was not the first time Lewis had fought to prove his worth. The year before, in 1993, he had scored his maiden Test century in Madras, a remarkable achievement for any cricketer, especially one who had spent his career branded primarily as a bowler. It was meant to be his redemption, the moment that silenced critics. But England's series defeat swallowed the triumph whole. Instead of celebration, the headlines focused on failure. His personal success was ignored, overshadowed by collective disappointment. It was as if every time he climbed, the ground gave way beneath him. By the mid-1990s, the promise that once surrounded his name had faded. The same journalists who once hailed him as England's next great hope now dismissed him as a symbol of wasted potential. His confidence, chipped away by years of criticism, began to show cracks. Coaches questioned his focus, selectors hesitated. Fans, once inspired by his raw talent, now whispered doubts about his discipline and attitude. But beneath the noise lay something deeper, an athlete worn down not by failure alone, but by a system that mocked vulnerability and demanded perfection. The Pratt without a hat incident wasn't just about a sunstroke. It was about how a moment of human error could define an entire career. For Chris Lewis, it was the beginning of isolation, a descent that would eventually pull him from the sport he loved into a far darker chapter of his life. When Chris Lewis was dropped from the England squad, it wasn't just a professional setback, it was the beginning of exile. He returned to the domestic circuit, moving between Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire and Surrey, trying to find a place where he still belonged. On the field, his talent never truly faded. There were still moments when his pace and precision reminded everyone why he had once been England's great hope. But no performance could erase the damage done to his reputation. The headlines that once celebrated him now treated him as a cautionary tale, brilliant, unpredictable, and increasingly alone. Then came the claim that would seal his fate. Lewis alleged that several England teammates had taken bribes to fix matches. It was an explosive statement, one that challenged the integrity of the sport's highest institutions. But without evidence, the accusation backfired. Teammates turned their backs. Administrators distanced themselves. What might have been an act of integrity was seen as bitterness. Within dressing rooms, silence replaced camaraderie. Trust vanished. Cricket, which had once been his refuge, now became his confinement. The sport that had lifted him to fame was closing its doors on him one by one. Whispers followed him everywhere. He was difficult, unstable, reckless. The same system that once praised his discipline now painted him as a liability. His every move was second-guessed, his every statement twisted. The media found in him a convenient villain, a man who had fallen and perhaps deserved to. Lewis, however, wasn't just battling perception. He was battling isolation. The life of a professional cricketer is built around belonging to a team, a dressing room, a shared dream. Stripped of that, he became a ghost of his former self, drifting between counties, playing for clubs that offered little more than temporary shelter. He still gave his all, bowling fast, mentoring young players trying to rebuild, but it was clear the sport had moved on. His name no longer carried admiration, it carried unease. By the late 1990s, he was fading into the margins. The English cricket establishment had quietly pushed him out, not through official bans or dismissals, but through absence. No call-ups, no offers, no interest. Every door he knocked on seemed to close faster than the last. He had once represented the future of English cricket. Now he symbolised what happens when the system decides you don't fit anymore. Still, he couldn't let go. Cricket had been his identity, his purpose, his only constant. Even as opportunities dried up, he kept trying, coaching small clubs, mentoring youngsters, chasing one last chance to prove that he wasn't finished. In 2008, long after most had forgotten him, he attempted a comeback with Surrey. The intent was genuine, but the body couldn't follow. Years of struggle had taken their toll. He bowled a few overs, played a few matches, but the dream was gone. The sport had moved on, and so had the crowd. Lewis's decline wasn't the story of a man who lost his talent. It was the story of a man gradually erased by the system he once served. He wasn't defeated by age or performance. He was defeated by the machinery of reputation, by politics, by whispers that turned into truth simply because they were repeated enough. What remained was a man stripped of purpose, watching from the outside as the game he loved continued without him. In that quiet exclusion lay the cruelest truth of all. Chris Lewis wasn't pushed out because he failed cricket. He was pushed out because cricket no longer had room for his kind of honesty. On December 8, 2008, Chris Lewis stepped off a flight from St. Lucia at Gatwick Airport, a man once celebrated for his strength, now unaware that within hours his life would collapse. Customs officers, acting on suspicion, examined his luggage and discovered a liquid-filled compartment inside his suitcase. Hidden within it was 3.37 kilograms of cocaine, valued at roughly 140,000 pounds. The discovery was irrefutable. Lewis insisted the drugs weren't his, claiming he had been set up. But in the eyes of the law and the public, the verdict had already been written. The trial at Croydon Crown Court was relentless. Prosecutors portrayed him as a fallen star, desperate for a shortcut back to relevance and financial security. The same newspapers that once called him England's next great hope now branded him a criminal. The ridicule was merciless. Sponsors distanced themselves. Former teammates refused to comment. For a man who had lived under constant scrutiny, this was the final humiliation. Not the loss of freedom, but the loss of dignity. On May 20, 2009, Lewis was sentenced to 13 years in prison. The court's decision was delivered coldly, clinically, but behind those legal formalities lay years of silent collapse. Financial instability had eaten away his stability. Mental fatigue had clouded his reason. He wasn't chasing greed. He was chasing purpose, relevance, and escape from the void that success had left behind. The arrogance many accused him of was never arrogance at all. It was despair hidden beneath pride, a man trying to convince himself he hadn't lost everything. When the prison gates closed behind him, Chris Lewis ceased to be a cricketer or even a public figure. He became a cautionary echo of what fame can destroy, a man once loved, now forgotten, left alone with his past and the unbearable weight of what he'd become. Prison is a place where time stops, and for Chris Lewis, it was the first time he was truly forced to sit still. The man who once lived in the noise of stadiums now woke up to silence, metal doors, and the echo of his own mistakes. In the beginning, it was chaos. Shame clung to him like a second skin. He was angry at the world, angry at the betrayal, but mostly angry at himself. For years, Lewis had blamed others, selectors, the media, bad luck. Now, there was no one left to blame. Just walls, time, and truth. Those early months were brutal. Stripped of recognition, he was just another inmate with a number. The arrogance that once hid his insecurities began to dissolve. Slowly, the man who had once been defined by sport started to redefine himself. He began mentoring younger prisoners, introducing them to cricket, teaching them discipline, teamwork, and respect. The game that once trapped him inside ego now became his path toward humility. Through teaching, he rediscovered what sport was meant to represent, not glory, but growth. Lewis started to write letters, notes, fragments of memory. Over time, these reflections became his form of therapy. 6 years in confinement gave him something that decades of fame never did: perspective. He began to see how his downfall was never just one mistake. It was a series of unchecked decisions driven by pride and denial. And for the first time, he began to make peace with that truth. When he walked out of prison in 2015, freedom felt unfamiliar. The world had moved on. Cricket had evolved. Players had changed. And Lewis, once a national name, was now a forgotten figure. But he didn't chase attention. He wasn't looking for headlines anymore. He wanted purpose. Within months, he began working with the Professional Cricketers Association, guiding young players on how to manage their finances and mental health, areas where he himself had once failed. He told them what contracts and trophies couldn't teach, how to survive when the cheering stops. In 2018, he published Crazy, My Road to Redemption, an autobiography that was less about sport and more about survival. It was an honest account of self-destruction and rebuilding. He didn't hide his crimes or his shame. He wrote about them because they defined the man he had become, honest, grounded, and painfully aware of his flaws. That same year, a stage play titled The Long Walk Back was released, retelling his journey from fame to prison and back. It wasn't a celebration, it was a confession. Watching his story unfold from the outside allowed him to see himself clearly for the first time. Lewis no longer lived for applause. His new life revolved around speaking to others, schools, clubs, prisons, sharing what his downfall had taught him. He didn't speak with bitterness or regret, but with clarity. The man who once thought he had all the answers now admitted how little he'd understood. He had once fallen victim to fame, chasing validation until it destroyed him. Now, he spoke of responsibility, humility, and the importance of failure in shaping a man's strength. Chris Lewis found redemption not in cricket, but in honesty. He didn't seek forgiveness from the world. He earned peace within himself. And for someone who had lost everything, that peace was victory enough. His story no longer belonged to headlines or judgment. It belonged to those who listened and learned. The boy from Georgetown, the man who wore England's colours, and the prisoner who rebuilt himself all became one truth. Redemption, he learned, isn't given. It's earned, one honest day at a time. Chris Lewis's legacy remains divided. For some, he's a fallen athlete, a warning about wasted potential and the fragility of fame. For others, he stands as living proof that redemption is possible, that mistakes need not define an entire life. The truth lies somewhere between the two. Cricket remembers him as a man of brilliance and inconsistency, but the person behind the statistics carried burdens far heavier than numbers could show. He faced ridicule, cultural alienation, and expectations that few could withstand. His failure was not one decision. It was years of quiet unraveling. Yet, his return from disgrace reframed that story. Through mentoring, writing, and the stage play, The Long Walk Back, Lewis confronted his past with rare honesty. His journey forces uncomfortable reflection, not on his crime alone, but on how society treats those who fall. His life became a mirror, revealing that redemption is never about perfection. It's about the courage to rebuild after being broken. Chris Lewis's story doesn't end with applause, nor with condemnation. It ends with understanding. Time took away everything the world once celebrated: fame, fortune, admiration. But in return, it gave him something the spotlight never could: clarity. He came to realize that redemption isn't about getting another chance. It's about finally understanding the one you had. From Georgetown to London, from international cricket grounds to the isolation of a prison cell, Lewis lived both extremes of the human experience. His journey exposed the fragile line between triumph and self-destruction, success and solitude. It forced a question few dare to ask: do we want our heroes to be perfect or simply human? The man who once bowled for England now speaks not of glory, but of growth. His words carry the stillness of someone who has faced himself and survived. He no longer seeks validation. He seeks meaning. Chris Lewis's life became more than a cautionary tale. It became a study in resilience, proof that even from ruin, something honest can emerge. His fall was public, his recovery personal. And within that contrast lies his truth. Sometimes, to find peace, you must first lose everything that once defined you.